By July 27, 1944, the German defensive line in Normandy finally broke. After 7 weeks of brutal stalemate in the hedgerows, American forces achieved what had seemed impossible since D-Day, a clean operational breakthrough. U.S. armor moved into open terrain. German units began withdrawing in disorder. Command reports showed gaps widening across the front. The road toward Paris was suddenly open. 4 days later, George Patton's Third Army would surge through that opening and race across France. Patton would become the public face of the breakout. His name would dominate headlines and post-war memory. But the breakthrough itself did not belong to Patton. It was created by Lawton Collins. In 1944, Collins was 48 years old, the youngest corps commander in the United States Army. His age had already counted against him. Douglas MacArthur had rejected him for corps command in the Pacific, citing insufficient seniority. Omar Bradley took a different view. Bradley valued performance over rank, and he had followed Collins's career closely. Before the war, the two men had known each other at the infantry school. Bradley remembered Collins as decisive, aggressive, and willing to accept calculated risk. Those traits defined Collins' wartime record. In the Pacific, he had commanded the 25th Infantry Division on Guadalcanal and New Georgia. His units moved faster than expected, advanced aggressively, and maintained pressure on the enemy. The pace of his operations earned him a nickname that followed him to Europe: Lightning Joe. When Bradley needed a corps commander for a critical role in the Normandy invasion, Collins was his choice. On D-Day, Collins's 7th Corps landed at Utah Beach. Casualties were lighter than at other landing zones, but the landing itself was not the decisive task. Collins's real mission began inland. The Allied invasion depended on logistics. Fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements all had to arrive by sea. Without a major port, the Allied armies in France would eventually stall. That port was Cherbourg. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the city. Coastal artillery covered the approaches. Defensive positions were layered and reinforced. The garrison was prepared to resist for as long as possible. The original Allied plan called for capturing Cherbourg within 9 days. Even planners acknowledged the timeline was optimistic. Collins had less than 3 weeks. On June 6th, instead of pausing to consolidate the beachhead, 7th Corps pushed inland immediately. Collins drove his forces north across the Cotentin Peninsula, advancing through villages, crossroads, and hedgerows defended at close range. Losses were constant. The advance continued regardless. By June 22nd, Collins' forces reached the outskirts of Cherbourg. The German commander refused surrender demands. Collins ordered a coordinated assault from multiple directions. 5 days later, on June 27th, organized resistance ended. Cherbourg was captured. The most important logistical objective in Normandy was now in American hands. The port that would sustain millions of Allied soldiers belonged to 7th Corps. The achievement received brief attention, then the focus shifted south. Because beyond Cherbourg, the American advance ran into a different kind of enemy, one that halted entire armies. The bocage. Ancient hedgerows divided Normandy into thousands of small enclosed fields. Each hedgerow formed a natural defensive barrier. Tanks could not penetrate them. Infantry could not see beyond them. German machine guns were concealed behind earthen banks. Mortars were pre-registered on likely crossing points. Every advance exposed U.S. troops to close-range fire. Progress slowed dramatically. In many sectors, gains were measured in yards per day, and it was in this terrain that Collins would face the decision that defined his role in the Normandy campaign. Casualties continued to rise into the thousands. The fighting in the hedgerows became a confined, grinding struggle. Units fought for a single field, took it, and then immediately faced another identical position beyond it. German defenders were rarely visible until they opened fire at close range. The psychological strain was severe. Morale across First Army units began to erode under the pressure of an enemy that could not be clearly identified or decisively engaged. By mid-July, First Army had advanced barely 15 miles from the Normandy beaches. The original operational plan called for a penetration of nearly 60 miles by that point. Instead, the front remained locked in place. Omar Bradley understood the implications. His army was taking steady losses without achieving operational depth. The hedgerows were consuming manpower faster than they could be replaced. If the situation continued, the American advance would stall indefinitely. Bradley needed a decisive breakthrough. He needed speed. He needed aggression. He turned to J. Lawton Collins. The plan Bradley approved was Operation Cobra, the most ambitious American offensive attempted in Europe up to that point. The concept was straightforward. Concentrate overwhelming force on a narrow frontage, shatter the German defenses with massive aerial bombardment, then drive armored forces through the breach before German reserves could react. Execution, however, carried enormous risk. Bradley selected a 5-mile sector west of St. Lo as the breakout point. The assault would be conducted by 7th Corps. Collins would command the operation. Some senior officers questioned the decision. 7th Corps had just completed the Cherbourg campaign. Its divisions were worn down. Fresh units were available elsewhere. Bradley dismissed the objections. Collins, in his view, was the most capable corps commander he had. Cobra would require rapid judgment, relentless pressure, and immediate exploitation. Bradley believed Collins could deliver all three. The success or failure of the Normandy campaign now rested on that judgment. On July 24, 1944, more than 2,000 American aircraft were assembled to carry out the largest tactical bombing mission of the war. The air attack was intended to obliterate German positions directly in front of 7th Corps. Weather intervened. Poor visibility forced a postponement, but not before some bombers had already released their loads. Bombs fell short of the target zone. American frontline positions were struck. More than 150 U.S. soldiers were killed or wounded by friendly fire. Collins observed the situation from his command post. The ground assault was delayed until the following day. On July 25th, the bombers returned. Weather conditions improved, and the full strike was executed. Over 4,000 tons of explosives were dropped onto a target area less than 2 miles wide. Once again, bombs fell short. This time, the losses were even heavier. 111 American soldiers were killed. Nearly 500 were wounded. Among the dead was Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. For the troops on the ground, the bombardment was overwhelming. The concussion turned sound into physical force. When the explosions ended, the cries coming from the impact zone were not German. They were American. Before the infantry had even advanced, Collins had already lost hundreds of men. Worse still, there was no clear indication whether the bombing had achieved its purpose. The only way to know was to attack. 7th Corps infantry moved forward into the devastated area, expecting shattered defenses. Instead, they encountered German survivors. Machine gun positions that had escaped destruction reopened fire. Progress was slow and costly. By nightfall on July 25th, 7th Corps had only marginally penetrated the German line. Bradley feared the worst. If the Germans were still intact, Cobra would fail like every previous attempt in the hedgerows. Collins read the reports differently. German counterattacks were uncoordinated. Prisoners appeared stunned and disoriented. Communications between German units had collapsed. Command and control were breaking down. The line, though not yet breached, was no longer stable. Collins recognized what others had not. The German defense was beginning to come apart. The German line was cracking. J. Lawton Collins now faced a decision that would determine the outcome of the Normandy campaign. Standard doctrine called for infantry to fully secure a breakthrough before committing armored formations. Collins rejected that approach. Instead, he ordered his armor forward immediately. It was an extreme risk. If the German line stabilized, American tank columns would be exposed deep inside enemy territory, vulnerable to counterattack and encirclement. Entire armored divisions could be destroyed. The decision rested entirely with Collins. If he failed, the responsibility would be his alone, not only for the loss of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, but for potentially derailing the Allied invasion itself. Senior commanders waited. No one interfered. Collins trusted his assessment. German defenses were disorganized. Command and control had collapsed. Delay would allow the enemy time to recover. On July 26, 1944, 7th Corps armor advanced. American tank units identified weak points and pushed through them at speed. Instead of stopping to eliminate every German strongpoint, they bypassed resistance that would have halted infantry formations. The emphasis was momentum. For the first time since D-Day, American forces penetrated deeply into German-held territory without being immediately contained. German commanders attempted to establish new defensive lines. They failed. American armor arrived before those lines could be formed. By July 27th, the German 7th Army was reporting catastrophic conditions, multiple breaches, no available reserves, and rapidly collapsing cohesion. 7 distinct ruptures were identified across the front. The hedgerow war ended. What followed was mobile warfare. Maneuver replaced attrition. 7th Corps had broken the German army in Normandy. The breakthrough Allied commanders had sought since June 6th was now real. Beyond the shattered front lay open country. The road network favored rapid movement. Paris was no longer theoretical. German forces in the west were approaching collapse. For a brief moment, the success belonged entirely to Collins. That moment lasted 5 days. On August 1, 1944, George S. Patton's Third Army became operational. Patton had spent months sidelined after disciplinary incidents, commanding a fictitious force as part of Allied deception operations. Now he was given real troops and a clear mission: exploit the breakthrough. Patton executed his orders with speed and aggression. Third Army surged through the gap 7th Corps had opened and drove rapidly across France. Armored columns advanced distances that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. German resistance collapsed into retreat. The media focused on Patton. Correspondents followed his headquarters. Newspapers highlighted his advances, his statements, and his image. His personality translated easily into headlines. Few reports mentioned who had created the breakthrough. Patton was exploiting success. Collins had created the conditions that made exploitation possible. The pattern continued. While cameras followed Third Army, 7th Corps continued the hardest fighting. Collins's formations captured Aachen, the first German city taken by Allied forces. They pushed through elements of the Siegfried Line and sustained pressure along the front. Public attention remained elsewhere. This was not deliberate misrepresentation. Patton was outspoken, visually distinctive, and comfortable with publicity. Collins was reserved, methodical, and uninterested in personal exposure. One made compelling copy. The other delivered results. Even Omar Bradley, who understood Collins's role fully, could not shift the public narrative. By December 1944, most Americans were unfamiliar with Collins' name. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. As American lines bent under pressure, Collins was again placed in a critical role. While other units held the northern shoulder of the German penetration, 7th Corps was assigned to counterattack into the exposed flank. Collins executed the maneuver methodically, helping collapse the offensive from the north. Public attention focused elsewhere. Patton's dramatic maneuver to relieve Bastogne dominated headlines. His rapid redeployment became legendary. Collins's contribution received minimal coverage. The pattern held to the end of the war. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Lawton Collins had fought continuously from Utah Beach to the Elbe River. He had captured Cherbourg. He had broken the German line during Operation Cobra. He had played a decisive role in stopping the Battle of the Bulge. Later, Omar Bradley wrote that if the U.S. Army had created an additional field army in Europe, Collins would have commanded it. Despite his age and lack of seniority, German generals later identified Collins as one of the 2 most capable American Corps commanders they faced. None of that shaped public memory. After the war, Collins served as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the Korean War, from 1949 to 1953. He received the Army Distinguished Service Medal 3 times. The Soviet Union awarded him the Order of Suvorov twice. His nephew, Michael Collins, later piloted the Apollo 11 command module while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon. None of it made him famous. When Americans think about the Normandy breakout, they think about George S. Patton racing across France. They do not think about the commander who made that race possible. The capture of Cherbourg became a footnote. Operation Cobra is remembered for its exploitation, not for the decision that broke the German line. The youngest Corps commander in the U.S. Army won every major engagement he fought. He delivered the most important port in Normandy and the decisive breakthrough of the campaign. History moved on anyway. The men who served under Collins understood what he had done. Bradley knew. Dwight D. Eisenhower knew. The public never really did. Collins died in 1987 at the age of 91. His obituaries noted his service, but they did not turn him into a legend. Meanwhile, Patton's reputation continued to grow. Films were made, books were written. His image became synonymous with American victory in Europe. Collins received a paragraph in other people's stories. The breakthrough that changed the war belonged to Lightning Joe Collins. The fame belonged to someone else. That is often how history works. Sometimes the man who does the decisive work is not the one who gets remembered. On July 27, 1944, the German line broke. Collins made it happen. Patton made it famous. Both statements are true, but history tends to remember the thunder and forget the lightning. If you found this story valuable, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people discover these overlooked chapters of World War II. Subscribe if you want more documented, fact-driven military history, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps us understand how far these stories are reaching. Thank you for watching.